President and the Foreign Policy Advisor, John Poindexter, came in with others and informed the President that the news had just broken. We immediately adjourned our Oval Office meeting and went into an adjoining room, the President's study, where there's a television, and the President then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch. So once again, the President is concerned, he is saddened, he is very anxious to have more information on it. At the moment, as I say, we're learning most of our information from what the public is getting.
What is your best information?
Spokesman Speaks said that the President watched the explosion, the tape replay, in stunned silence, that he really did not say much, but that the tragic emotion was on his face and very evident. Speaks said that, of course, the White House is trying to get further information, that was their top priority, to find out just what had happened, particularly the concern for the crew. It was, of course, President Reagan who came up with the program for sending a teacher in space, the first civilian to make that trip. And there is that distinct link between the President and the space program. In response to most questions, the White House spokesman really could not make any definitive answer at this point, too much unknown. As far as the space program itself goes, Spokesman Larry Speaks said, despite the tragedy, that should not deter the U.S. space program, which has been one of this nation's great successes. Reed?
Charles, of course, the President has a public duty to perform tonight his State of the Union address at 9 Eastern Time. It seems, does it not, almost inevitable that this is going to cast a long and mournful shadow over even that?
Well, the President had hoped to make the kind of speech that was being described here as visionary, laying out his hopes for this country through into the next century. I think it is fair to guess, in fact, Mr. Speaks sort of indicated that the President would be compelled to have something to say about this tragedy, and I think we will hear that tonight. Yes, it does indeed cast a pall on this event.
But that is the latest live from the White House, where, as Charles says, the President has been informed. And now let's go back to the scene in NASA Live.
Approximately a minute or so after tower clear, there was an apparent explosion of the orbiter. At the time, data was lost approximately a minute into the flight. That was shortly after throttle up to 104% of the three main engines. The flight director polled flight controller positions in the room later on and this morning, and was informed that there were no anomalous indications at the time. Tracking reported impact of the vehicle with the water. According to data, that was approximately 18 miles downrange at the time. Data.
Among the Americans who saw the devastation that struck America's space program and 7 people aboard the space shuttle were the husband of 37-year-old New Hampshire school teacher Krista McAuliffe and her 9-year-old daughter. It was last July 19th that CNN correspondent Tony Clark talked with Krista McAuliffe as she prepared for her role aboard the shuttle.
The training will start in September.
Did you think that you were ever going to fail in any part of the testing?
No, that wasn't really part of the evaluation process. So even if I had gotten sick on it, I'd still be all right.
Were you surprised by any of the testing or anything? Did you think it was harder than...
The intensity of it, just lots and lots of things crammed into a week. I mean, we were just running from early in the morning till late at night.
Do you think that was part of the training or the testing?
Well, maybe, but I think they were also, they knew that we only had us for a short period of time. They were just trying to cram as much as possible so that we could really experience everything that we could in that short period of time.
Scott said today you were going to take one of his pet frogs along on the flight. Is that going to be one of the pieces of the cargo?
Yes, we're going to put that frog right on the shuttle.
This is Scott?
This is Scott.
Okay. Scott, how are you? Does the frog have a name yet? Legal, the frog is going to go into space? That's part of the deal. Does NASA know about this?
I do have a personal compartment on board the shuttle. I can't take some things along with me. Not big enough for any of you, but...
Actually, have you seen the inside? You must have seen the inside of one of these things.
Yeah.
A personal compartment. How comfortable is it?
It's probably about this big and about that wide, so that you can bring some things that you know, like to bring. Yeah. T-shirts that you're going to wear and things for your family.
What kind of T-shirts you're going to wear?
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to get a good New Hampshire one.
Can you tell us about the camaraderie between you and the other 9 finalists?
Oh, it's just wonderful. It really is. I mean, we went through so much. All I can liken it to is having a small bunch of kisses.
Kristen, finally, what's it like?
Where's City Bob? Oh, she's resting? Oh, who's with her? Oh.
Now it's 20 seconds.
It's a long 20 seconds. Is this like a countdown?
Well, now it's not. I don't know.
Dion, Krista is here with me now. She just got off the plane a while ago, and I know that you were chosen for this mission partly because of your disposition. You've been giggling since you got here. Tell me. Why, again, you've said it so many times, why is this so important to you, making this trip on the shuttle?
Well, it's important for a lot of reasons, but I think the most important thing is to humanize the space age to a point where everybody feels a part of it, and the students really connect with that. They're the wave of the future. They're the ones who are going to have to deal with the space stations and beyond, and I really hope and feel that it's part of the teaching profession to bring those new career opportunities. I know, it's wonderful.
Okay, all right, so how's it feel to be back in New Hampshire?
It feels great to be home. I am really delighted because I kept hearing about all of these wonderful things that people were doing while I was down in Washington, while I was down in Houston, and I couldn't share with that. You know, and Steve would tell me on the phone, and he'd say, you know, you got some letters, or, you know, people called, and I couldn't share with that, so I'm really glad I'm home.
How long are you going to be home for?
Well, hopefully I'll be home on and off for about a month, so I'll be able to spend some time in New Hampshire.
Yeah. I've got to ask you, when did you find out? Did you find out just before the announcement, or?
Yeah, we did. We asked as a group, we requested that we find out prior to going into the room. It was a small room. There were a lot of press there. We've invested an awful lot of emotion in these last 2 weeks, and we really felt that we needed to find out and compose ourselves before walking into the room. So we did know before we walked in.
What were your feelings when you found out?
Well, it was rather funny when we were talking about what was happening at home, and I was saying something to the effect that, you know, well, you know, when I'm not home, and I said my husband really relies on cornflakes and milk because that's kind of his staple. And Ann Bradley turned around and kind of, without missing a beat, she turned around and she said to me while the whole group was together, she said, I think you better buy some more cornflakes and milk.
The students at Krista McAuliffe's Concord High School in New Hampshire were among those watching the launch, the liftoff on television. They cheered, and they continued to cheer, not realizing something had gone wrong, until a teacher hushed them, told them to be quiet because she knew something had gone wrong. At that point, students were overheard saying, "This can't be real, we can't be watching this." The school principal then asked all reporters and photographers to leave the school. Reed?
Bob, as we've heard, the president was in the White House. He quickly was summoned and watched some of the terrifying replays of the disaster that overtook Challenger. Across the Potomac, the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, was in his office complex as well. He was conferring with other people about the business of defense. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Crowell, was with him, we understand. The secretary was advised of what had befallen the Challenger, and he quickly adjourned his meeting, went to an adjoining television room to watch. Caspar Weinberger watched, as you have also, and his comment was, "Oh, no." Then his concern was apparent from that comment only, shocked and disappointed. But the quote from the Secretary of Defense, probably that of all of America, Bob, "Oh, no." Mary Ann.
Also at the Cape, or just actually 3.5 miles from the Cape, watching as it happened this morning, were Krista McAuliffe's two parents, Edward and Grace Corrigan, were watching from a VIP area some 3.5 miles away. The wire services are reported observing the two of them hugging and sobbing as they saw the explosion aboard the shuttle. NASA, immediately after the explosion on the shuttle, was silent for quite some time, made hardly any reference rather than acknowledging that there had been an explosion and there were recovery efforts underway. We did have one official statement from NASA, and we'll play that back for you now.
We had an apparently nominal liftoff this morning at 11:38 Eastern Time. The ascent phase appeared normal through approximately the completion of the roll program and throttle down and engine throttle back to 104%. At that point, we had an apparent explosion. Subsequent to that, the tracking crews reported to the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle appeared to have exploded and that we had an impact in the water downrange at a location approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. At the time the data was lost with the vehicle, according to a poll by the flight director Jay Green of the positions here in Mission Control, there were no anomalous indications, no indications of problems with the engines or with the SRBs or with any of the other systems at that moment through the point at which we lost data. Again, this is preliminary information. It's all that we have at the moment.
Well,
It was about 1 minute into flight when the explosion took place, but for 55 minutes, downrange about 9 miles from the Kennedy Space Center, the debris continued to fall. That prevented, according to NASA, some of the emergency operations from moving into the area for that amount of time. But most of the pieces that we could at least see through our picture falling through after the explosion. Here's a replay in slow motion. You can see the fire develop on both sides of the external tank, and in about a half a second, you'll see it break apart right there. And it turns into a fireball. Then, one of the solid rocket boosters, can't tell whether it's the right one or the left one, careens off to the right-hand side, still intact. The solid rocket booster was intact. Huge fireball where the shuttle sits next to the external tank. There's the solid rocket that's going off to the right. And in just a second, you'll see the other solid rocket, also still intact, going to the left. The silence of NASA came when you were looking at the same pictures that we're looking at now. With all of the fire and the smoke, you couldn't really see through it to see if the shuttle was still there. The first indication that it wasn't was when they said they lost all communications, all downlink video with the shuttle. These are the spectators that were watching.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second, altitude 4.3 knots.
This is raw, unedited video, just sent via satellite.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go and throttle up.
The picture you were just seeing was Christy McCullough's parents watching in horror. These are the students from her school.
Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Many of them probably had their view blocked just as we did with the television cameras, with just a huge fireball and a huge cloud of smoke. They may not realize yet what has happened. You see concern etched on their faces. The breath that they've been holding release. And then the realization sets in.
High tech. Some of America's best and brightest young people, some of the most complex machinery and electrical apparatus in the history of humankind. It happened at Challenger's moment of full thrust, point of highest stress, where metal meets air at 2,000 miles an hour. It happened in real time before noon. a slow-motion horror for all who watched.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. And it has cleared the tower.
The president, like all Americans, watched this on television.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up. Obviously a major malfunction. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. Joining us now in Los Angeles is Leo Krupp, a former shuttle test pilot for Rockwell International. Leo Krupp, good to have you with us this evening. What I would like for you to do, first of all, is let's take a look of the videotape from today. Talk us through it, where the places are, where there are questions, where the suspicions are. But before we do that, let's take a look at the scale model we have in the studio with us, Leo Krupp, and check me as we go along here. Just a reminder that the space orbiter, the spaceship itself, the Space Shuttle Challenger, is attached to this huge fuel tank which contains liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, highly explosive. Off on the sides are the solid rocket fuel boosters, 2 of them. And in space shuttles, the plan is for the whole apparatus, the engines at the tail of the space shuttle, plus the solid rocket boosters, all to go off the launch pad in one big thrust, and it has to be throttled back a bit, then throttled forward, and as it reaches just past the 2-minute mark, the plan is for the solid rocket boosters to jettison away and fall away. The space shuttle, with its engines down here, continues on up using the fuel out of this tank on upward towards space, and eventually the big fuel tank itself drops off, leaving the shuttle to orbit the Earth. Now, that's the way it has worked in the past. Now, Leo Krupp, I want to remind you, if I may, or perhaps point out to you if you had a chance to read it, that the
takeoff moments after the engines had been fired. Resnick later expressed confidence in the shuttle's safety systems.
After it all happened, we were all very grateful that the safety features do what they're supposed to do on the orbiter, and I think that the system has been designed such that anything that could present a problem will be taken care of by these safety features.
When Resnick wasn't flying, she sometimes doubled as a commentator, helping bring to life for television viewers what it was like to take off on board the shuttle. Gregory Jarvis, age 41, was a Hughes aircraft engineer on board Challenger to conduct tests on the effect of weightlessness on liquids carried in tanks. NASA hoped his experiments would provide information for the design of liquid fuel rockets. He was born in Detroit and trained as an Air Force satellite engineer. He was married but had no children. Missions
liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Now, there's actually 3 tanks inside of the large external tank. On the top is the liquid oxygen. In the middle, there is sort of a connecting tank between the two, an intertank they call it. On the bottom is the liquid hydrogen. Now, there was some speculation earlier on that perhaps there may have been a rupture in one of the bulkheads that separates the liquid oxygen from the liquid hydrogen. Nobody is saying that officially or unofficially, but it's one of the theories that's floating around right now. The orbiter itself mounted on the outside of that. This, of course, the crew compartment, all of them in here. Right underneath here is one of the points where, as you say on that computer-enhanced graphics, we could see one of the explosions. It was interesting, and again, when we talk about theories, we must emphasize that they are theories, nothing more at this point, nothing official. But that's one of the points right here where the external tank is connected to the orbiter. There's another point down here. Now, in the sequence of launch, that external tank is separated by exploding bolts, and there was some speculation that perhaps one of the bolts had exploded prematurely. It almost seemed like the explosion, once starting here, kind of snaked its way upward, but that again is all speculation at this point. The numbers, Tom, the numbers of the...
Now, we're just about to see that, I think, Leo Krupp, in a few seconds.
nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Okay, as we switch to the side view, just watch toward the aft end of the solid rocket booster, and you'll see some little flame patterns come out, and those appear to be the ignition source. There you can see them, and there's no doubt the fuel for the explosion came from the external tank. But the question is what caused it, and NASA, I'm sure, will have an answer for this after they recover all the debris and look at all the data.
Now, Leo Krupp, let's do as we have done during the day, take a closer look at the critical moments just before and during the explosion in slow motion. This is the side view that you mentioned.
Okay, you can see the little flame leaks coming back there now, just forward of the nozzle. And you'll see one that jumps up forward and impinges up on the belly of the vehicle, up near where the umbilical from the external tank, right there. And that provided the ignition source, which resulted in the catastrophic explosion.
Leo Krupp, former shuttle test pilot for Rockwell International. So our viewers and listeners can understand the area in which you called attention as one of the suspicion areas, while emphasizing all the way through that nobody actually can know what happened and why. What you were talking about, Leo, is was this area, this being the solid rocket booster on the left side.
You know, Mr. Vice President and Senators, and I'm sure I speak for all of the families.
When you have that happen,
we don't want this tragic accident to slow it down or stop it. And she said we know that our loved ones would feel the same way. And so just a very moving and touching experience.
Senator, you flew on the shuttle last April. You're an enormous supporter and very much a booster of the space program. What do you think today will do to America's program in space?
Well, obviously, we can't fly again until we determine the cause of this tragic accident. But once that has been determined, we make certain that it can't happen again, then the space program should continue. We have learned so much from space. It benefits all of God's children, every place on this earth. The basic research and development that goes on is so valuable to us, and that must continue. And I think we need to look at the fact that we flew 56 manned space missions, a remarkable safety record.
You know that.
So many things that could go wrong. Now the people who built the shuttle, people who feel a personal responsibility for the astronauts who ride aboard it, will be asked to take part in the investigation into exactly what did
take us in the reaction time of the crew.
At Auburn University's Space Power...
We want to talk about all of this further tonight with an assembled group of space experts. With me in Washington now is Florida Congressman Bill Nelson, who recently completed a shuttle
from his very first orbit.
The focus of the investigation as it begins as to where the explosion may have started, that massive external fuel tank is manufactured by Martin Marietta Aerospace in Louisiana. It contained 500,000 gallons of highly explosive fuel. The fuel is the most explosive element in the whole system, but we emphasize that nobody at Martin Marietta Aerospace or with NASA is saying that the explosion actually began in this tank. They simply do not know. Thank you very much, Leo Krupp in Los Angeles. We want to go now to Houston, where our old friend astronaut Alan Bean, former astronaut and present artist and painter Alan Bean, who flew on both the Apollo and Skylab missions. It's tough, I know, but Alan Bean, what runs through your mind as you watch the launch, having been there yourself? And if I may, I'm particularly interested in, based on your experience, what was happening to the crew members minute by minute from the seconds before launch right on through this disaster.
Well, Dan, from the time you get in up till about 15 minutes, you've got a fairly leisurely pace, and so you're thinking about the launch and you're thinking about how the mission's going to go. When it gets to be about 15 minutes to launch, things start to pick up speed, and you begin to just concentrate on your gauge readings, what the ground's telling you, and getting ready for the launch. At launch time, when the main engines ignite, you're watching the instruments. You're not thinking about anything except, what is it that I'm seeing? Is this right? And if it isn't right, what do I do? And that kind of mental attitude continues all the way through launch. So I feel fairly certain that the crew members, all during the first minute or minute and a half of launch, were looking at their gauges, listening to Houston and thinking, it's going well, everything's going good, everything's going just like we hoped it would go. And my feeling personally is that is what they thought all the time.
Now, this happened with such suddenness, Alan Dean, and there was no indication, no one heard any indication, no one saw any indication that the spacecraft was in any difficulty whatsoever. Things happened so quickly in there. We're talking about seconds, and in some cases nanoseconds. Speculation pure and simple. But would the commander and the pilot have had a gauge indication that something was wrong?
One of the things that you do when you design spaceships, of course, is you try to design them so they never fail. And that doesn't work. So if that doesn't work, then you say, what parts could possibly fail? Maybe a computer. Okay, we'll put 5 of them on board. How about the external tank? Well, we can't put 5 of those on board. They're too big. We better build the one we have and make sure it works. Don't bother putting a lot of instrumentation on there, because if something does go wrong, there's nothing you can do anyway. So I feel that if it was a failure of the external tank or the solid rocket booster up in the middle of it somewhere, like Leo was talking about, that there's no instrumentation there that the crew can readily get an indication that something's going wrong. So from their point of view, from their perspective, everything looks good.
There were no ejection seats in this space shuttle. There were in some of the very earliest of the space shuttle flights. There were ejection seats in the crew area, but none in this one today.
No, Dan, and my personal feeling as a result of what I just said is, even if this had been the first flight of the space shuttle, with John Young and Bob Crippen with ejection seats, that this kind of failure happened so fast and apparently with no warning, that they wouldn't have been able to use them. This kind of catastrophe is not what the seats are designed for. This is a catastrophe that just cannot be allowed to happen. In this case, of course, it did, and now engineers are going to have to go back and take a look, because this there is no crew member.
7 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Go with throttle up. And then it happens.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And it occurred with such lightning speed as one of the booster rockets flies randomly off into space, and we look at it again in slow motion, that you may have noticed that the control commander, the launch control voice that we've become so familiar with on launches, was simply reading his telemetry, his information coming back, and was not aware, as so many people were when they saw it, even though they didn't understand it in space. Lynn Scher, who covers space for us on a full-time basis. Lynn,
is to put people
base in California, and tell us now what we're seeing.
Well, Peter, we've just gotten past, obviously, the critical. This is the fireball. This is the catastrophic explosion engulfing the Challenger and the solid rockets. And I think in just a moment you will see the what we think there on the lower right of your screen appears to be Challenger's nose emerging from that big cloud, then falling into the ocean, our last view of Challenger. We have examined these tapes so many times, Peter, that we think we can at least try to pinpoint the sequence. At the right of your screen now, the solid rocket booster fizzling off into nowhere. Nowhere to go. It is controlled before launch, and it's meant, of course, to be attached to the shuttle and to the tank and to take them into orbit. But with that premature explosion, it has nowhere to go, and it's off into the ocean. And if I'm not mistaken, the next few frames will show us the crazy spinning of the 2 solid rocket boosters forming kind of an awkward Y-shaped as they each go off in kind of a cockeyed direction, obviously not where they're meant to be going at all. It looked to us, when we have screened this tape before, that the first flame appeared in between the external tank and the orbiter. Now that's the plume on the left. That's a little bit of the gas fuel for the fire, just the liquid hydrogen and oxygen burning off. There is where we thought we saw the first sign of flame. Actually, I think it was a little bit before this. Maybe we can go back and find that. In any event, this is the flame that is now going to ride up the external tank in between the tank and the orbiter, both of them extremely thin-skinned on purpose for weight reasons. They're not meant to withstand this kind of explosion, and obviously when that liquid hydrogen and oxygen gets near that kind of heat, boom, it just went in an instant, and no one I have talked to here on Earth believes that it happened in any more time than just an instant. The astronauts, the shuttle, simply did not have a chance.
And in other words, to not put too fine a point on it, they didn't know it hit them.
Absolutely not. I know that you and everybody were talking very hopefully for a while that perhaps those parachutes indicated they had gotten out. There really does not appear to be any way. That shuttle is simply not designed for that kind of explosion. Now, of course, the problem is what really happened. We can look at the sequence. We can pinpoint
his first flight, but he was the one who tried to relieve the pressure on the other. Warned that some of it could be dangerous.
There were explosives aboard the shuttle, the solid rocket boosters. There was also toxic chemicals, hydrogen tetroxide, other acids, hydrazine, which are all very, very toxic.
Ocean depth at the crash point is only between 100 and 200 feet deep. NASA is expected to talk to the Navy tomorrow about bringing in divers or subs to recover any sunken wreckage that it finds. David Hazinski, NBC News at the Kennedy Space Center.
The official investigation into what went wrong today could take months. More about that now from NBC News science correspondent Robert Bazell.
The only other possibility, and I'm sure...
Well, I was fortunate enough to go with the president.
...was that one of those boosters, one of those white crayon-like structures on the side, those big Roman candles, perhaps went awry before it split off. Our evidence from the footage we've seen does not seem to indicate that. Again, we're not going to know until they do all the analysis.
Well, Linda,
those are, again, just some of the theories.
Well, I'm just saying, just by suggesting some of the theories, you've opened an endless range of possibilities. One of the people who's been tremendously helpful to us today joins us again now from Houston, Gene Cernan, the former Apollo astronaut, the last man to walk on the moon. Gene, you've seen these same tapes over and over again today. What do they tell you?
Well, Peter, you know, we can speculate, I guess, all day long, but it does appear that something, Lynn's ideas are certainly have potential, but it appears to me that whatever it was, it violated the integrity of that tank and allowed the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen in some capacity to mix. And hydrogen is a tremendous explosive, and in this case, we saw the results of what can happen when it's mixed with something like oxygen.
Well, Gene, let me offer, if I may, to you another theory, if I could get a look at this model here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but about a year ago, the whole process was lightened up to some extent. And there was some suggestion today, at least by some people, that these struts, and Lynn has alluded to it, these things which basically hold the Challenger on to this enormous gas tank, which is really what it is, may have not been able to stand the stress. Do you buy that theory at all?
Well, of course, it's always possible, but, you know, the vehicle was designed to go through that area we've talked so much about today called maximum dynamic pressure. That's when, if you will, the speed of the aircraft and the density of the air create the greatest wind on the spacecraft during its ascent. It's designed specifically as for that point being a high stress point, where you get the greatest shaking, the greatest bending of the skins, the greatest flapping of the wings, if you want to go to exaggeration. That's a very critical point. It appears that this either occurred just subsequent to that point. There may have been a rupture as a result of that through fatigue.
Gene, there has been the obvious question asked today about an escape mechanism in a space capsule or something on board the shuttle. There was one on Columbia some time ago. Why not on Challenger?
Well, you know, the Columbia's first 4 flights, I think the crew, it was only a 2-man crew. They did have ejection seats. It was a test vehicle. If we go into history of the space program, no other manned spacecraft has been flown for the first time with a man aboard. They were all flown unmanned until we got to the space shuttle. We built ejection seats in so that the crew was able to make some decisions at different points of the missions had they needed to, had they had some inkling of a problem that was forthcoming. We decided when we put 5 and 6 and 7 people on and the shuttle became more operational, proved its capability, its reliability, that not only was there no need for those ejection seats, in a case like this, for instance, they would not have even done any good. There was an escape mechanism, and that was the shuttle itself. If the crew, if the ground had some idea that there was a problem occurring, a critical problem, even a couple moments ahead of time, they could have jettisoned that external tank, jettisoned those solid rockets, and although the maneuver is very complicated and difficult, landed back at Kennedy Space Center.
Gene, I'd like to point out, and I know that you know this too, of course they have that capability. As you well know, nobody really...
3. He was 46.
And I'm sure there'll be some problems to take care of along the way, which will be a challenge, and be able to come back and say I've done it, and hopefully go do it again quite a few times.
Smith was the co-pilot. He was 40. Judith Resnick, America's second woman in space and the first Jewish woman. And she was a TV expert on the Today Show.
And we get to do a little bit of everything and state of the art, and it's always a challenge.
She was 36. Krista McAuliffe was a high school teacher in Concord, New Hampshire. Her selection to be the first teacher in space had overshadowed the flight itself. She was 38.
I just took that chance, along with 11,000 other people, that it will give them maybe the inspiration to try something new and to take a chance.
11,000 other American teachers have lost out to her in the competition to be the first teacher in space. Ronald McNair, PhD in physics from MIT. McNair was the second black to have been in space, going for his second trip today.
You know, that wasn't the kind of thing a black kid thought about. You know, how do you get to do something like that? What do you do? And I pursued science with that in my mind, and it wasn't until recently that I saw a break to make a dream, you know, come true.
He was 35. Ellison Onizuka was 39. He was a Japanese-American from Hawaii. This would have been his second flight. He liked space work.
It's great. What a way to live.
Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force. The 7th crew member, Gregory Jarvis, engineer. Jarvis had been bumped from 2 previous flights to make room for politicians. Today was to have been his day.
I've been charged up since last March, and so this is kind of a culmination of a dream come true.
It was an all-American crew. Tom Pettit, NBC News, New York.
Today's shuttle mission had special meaning for teachers everywhere, of course, and the launch was watched in many classrooms across the country by students of all ages. One of those was the Centerville, Ohio classroom of James Rowley, who was the runner-up in NASA's search for the teacher astronaut. Also in that classroom today was Mike Conway of NBC affiliate WKEF in Dayton, Ohio.
It's lunch hour for these Centerville High School students, but they wanted to be in class, to be with science teacher Jim Rowley. The students knew what the shuttle launch meant to him. Rowley was one of the semi-finalists for the Teacher in Space flight. And besides being on the flight, Rowley said the best place to be was with his students, helping them understand this historic flight of the Challenger.
Main engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1. It's all rockets. You're right!
The interest soon turned to bewilderment. For a few minutes, even Rowley didn't understand what was happening.
So about 45 seconds after liftoff, a huge fireball. I don't understand.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Our director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
Can we get the cameras?
The reaction of all of us across the country today when we realized that this was no longer science fiction, that we were dealing with reality. For President Reagan, this was to have been an upbeat evening. Mr. Reagan had planned to set out his agenda.
It was supposed to carry the military's
sacrifice
space. Challenger's protective heat shield had been badly damaged, and the ship had to go in for an extensive overhaul. Last July was probably Challenger's worst month until today. 3 seconds before its scheduled liftoff, the countdown was stopped because of a coolant leak.
We have an RSLS abort. We have an abort.
Later that same month, Challenger came perilously close to disaster when it suffered what NASA called a launch emergency. One of its engines shut down while the spacecraft was climbing into orbit. The crew scrambled to jettison excess weight, but they could never get Challenger up to its full orbit. Challenger was supposed to fly 5 missions this year. One of them was to be a secret military payload, taking it into orbit. The military, in fact, has been so concerned about the reliability.
As a gifted group of science students proposed a teacher relate the shuttle launch, ever optimistic
tomorrow night.
Countdown of America's 25th shuttle expedition would finally be a go. Now school officials prepare to grapple with NASA's worst nightmare.
Once they had seen the evidence on the visual screen that there would be no survivors, it suddenly became apparent to them that they were dealing with death.
From a Soviet official in Washington, condolences and expressions of sympathy for the crew members' families.
We regret loss of lives of the crew, and we express deep sympathy to the relatives and friends of the perished astronauts.
In New York, producers and the studio crew of a Sesame Street program watched in horror as the spacecraft blew apart.
Because it's never happened before, I think possibly many people even involved.
The shocking spectacle was also seen in a city bar.
One of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen in my lifetime. I can't remember ever seeing anything like that, especially not with a NASA-related expedition. I'm appalled at it. I feel very bad for the families of those involved.
In a moment of mourning, one New Yorker paused to put the nation's loss into perspective.
It's just a terrible pity, it really is. But again, it shouldn't stop our program because we've got to keep going. It's doing so much for us in other areas.
And from Dr. Robert Jastrow, one of NASA's founding fathers, conviction that manned space flights must forge ahead.
You've got to have men up there, the brain behind the eyeball, to fix these automated factories that we hope to put into space and make sure the product keeps flowing. It just is necessary.
Administration to reach out.
Pioneering effort until it becomes
great heroes.
Hard-earned money on a mission. CNN, New York.
Beyond what we heard today, Chris, that you know about?
Well, nothing specific that we've heard of, but I know that the president takes his role almost as national father very seriously.
Young men,
he watched on TV, as all the rest of us did today, and he kept talking in a brief conversation with reporters about how terrible it must have been for the relatives, both children and adults, who had gone to the Cape to share in all the excitement and instead had been eyewitnesses to a terrible personal tragedy. I know that when those young servicemen died in the plane crash in Gander, he felt very strongly about going to Kentucky to a memorial service and meeting personally with all of the relatives there. And I'm sure he plans to do the same with certainly the relatives at a memorial service organized by NASA, and in any way he can to ease the pain and to gain some understanding in all this, not only for the school children, but for all of us.
And are any of the aides at the White House tonight talking about the wisdom of the civilian and space program? It was the president's idea to put a teacher in space, after all. A lot of cynics at the time thought it was just a, if you will, an election year gimmick to pick a teacher who happened to be a woman, who happened to be from New Hampshire, to go into space. And now, of course, we've had this tragic loss. There's already a program in effect for journalists to go in space as well. Are they having second thoughts about all that at the White House, Chris?
They certainly are sad, and they certainly, you know, a lot of these people had personally met Krista McAuliffe in the Roosevelt Room right across from the Oval Office. Just last July, she had been selected as the teacher in space, and many of them had met her. But I don't think there were any second thoughts. One of the points that the president made over and over again today was that space is the safest form of travel ever known to man. There had been 56 manned space flights in the American program. This is the first time that during a flight anyone had been lost. He and his top aides are all determined that nothing in this one accident be allowed to kill the space program.
It's worth pointing out that Senator Jake Garn of Utah, who was a veteran of the Space Shuttle program as well as one of the politicians in space, pointed out today that very statistic that you just talked about, and said each year 50,000 people are killed on the nation's highways, about half of them by drunk drivers, and we ought to be more exercised about that. Two NBC veterans of the exploration of space from its beginnings are NBC's Roy.
If you have seen the videotape of the disaster today on the Space Shuttle Challenger, bear with us, please, because some people have not. And if you've just joined us, we want to show it to you now. It did look like a perfect launch as the Challenger lifted off after a series of delays caused by weather and technical problems. The shuttle, with its crew of 7, left the launch pad at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time. The shuttle rose to 10 miles above the Atlantic Ocean, traveling at almost 2,000 miles per hour. Mission Control had just given the command to go to full power, and that was acknowledged by the shuttle commander, Dick Scobie.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go at throttle up.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance. 107 nautical miles.
It took a while for the spectators there at Kennedy Space Center to realize what had happened. Debris rained into the Atlantic Ocean for about 45 minutes as the rescuers converged on the scene. NASA finally announced there were no survivors.
Space exploration has survived several setbacks before today.
And
astronauts have expressed
the first and
also will survive this disaster. CNN's Greg Lamont reports now on the history of the U.S. space program.
The space race began in earnest after World War II. Both the United States and the Soviet Union perfected rockets and missiles. The next goal? To develop a spacecraft that could fly humans into space. The Soviets won that race, just barely, when they launched cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into a single orbit of the Earth in April of 1961. The U.S. launched their manned space program the next month when Mercury blasted off the launch pad. Alan Shepard was the first American to make the trip out of the Earth's atmosphere, but he didn't make a full orbit of the Earth. That honor went to John Glenn, now a U.S. Senator, in February of 1962. From the beginning, the space program was more than a scientific experiment. It was a matter of national pride and national security.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
But the road to the moon was a rocky one. In 1967, the first Apollo flight was set to go. Its 3 astronauts suited up for a test run. But tragedy struck when a fire broke out inside the spacecraft cabin. All 3 lost their lives. It was the first, and until now, the last fatalities in the U.S. space program. But NASA pressed on to the moon. And 5 Apollo flights later, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin landed their lunar module on the moon while Michael Collins circled in the main spacecraft. Armstrong was the first to step onto the surface.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
NASA landed crews on the moon 5 more times. With the U.S. clearly on top in the space race, NASA let military considerations take a back seat for a while.
Tom, it never came back. It was all in that fire.
This kind of moment has been in space of all of us who have space flight programs. After this message from...
We sure didn't. We expected it back in the days of Mercury. Pocket booster and the main fuel Glenn. They thought in Mercury control that his heat shield had come off. We also had a near tragedy when Liberty Bell 7 was lost, and Gus Grissom had to swim for his life just 100 miles downrange from here. And then, of course, there was the Apollo 13, where the nation held its breath for 4 days. But we had gotten to the point with 24 successful shuttle missions that we thought the computers, I suppose, Tom, would take care of everything. Well, today they didn't.
And Roy Neal, the scientist, and your contacts in NASA that you have talked to today, are they shocked? Are they being realistic about the possibility that this could have happened and it was going to happen sooner or later anyway? How are they feeling?
Well, first, Tom, they are shocked. They are mystified. And to them, this was something in many cases, particularly on the engineering rather than the science level, this was something that was indeed expected. They kept waiting for the axe to fall. And indeed, we at NBC, for example, in every case, at every liftoff and at every landing, have had the equipment standing by just in case.
Look to the future with the concerns
of flame. There, too.
Robert Wagner, Thursday at 7.
Was to have carried it.
And there, to the right, we're going to see one of the few recognizable pieces of debris from the space shuttle and its boosters. To the right, one of the solid rocket boosters before it headed into the Atlantic, breaking up on the way. Right there, a cigar-shaped cylinder. At the Kennedy Space Center today, an investigation was underway, an investigation into a national tragedy. Jan Fisher has more from the Kennedy Space Center.
Vice President George Bush, Senators Jacob Garn and John Glenn arrived at Kennedy Space Center early this evening. In a somber setting, they told a nation already shocked and dismayed that the crew of Challenger are safe now in God's arms, that they gave their lives helping to open new frontiers for their country.
Let me suggest a memorial to them. We must be as they were, great in spirit, great in courage, and great in dedication to the adventure of which they were so much a part.
This morning, NASA watched along with the rest of the nation as Challenger blew apart.
I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
NASA officials say an intense investigation is already underway. NASA also denies any allegations it was pressured to get this mission off the ground.
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program.
And find out what caused the accident.
By 1990, Jeff.
Make your take.
No. God moves in mysterious ways.
Being also
I guess from time to time to remind us of what mortal beings we really are, and that everything isn't all that sure.
The Washington day began on a note of pleasant expectation. The president would give his State of the Union message tonight, and his mood as he briefed congressional leaders on it was clearly upbeat.
Now that the Super Bowl is over, I can really say, welcome back. And Tip, I suspect the results were not all that you would have liked.
It was like the first year of your term, Mr.
But at 11:40, when the president received the news, the upbeat mood changed. Mr. Reagan watched the television replays horrified. He told reporters he was shocked and saddened, but that the State of the Union speech would go on. You can't...
As head of the Congressional Space and Technology Caucus,
agree. It certainly looks that way. But if you've ever seen photographs of the way they assemble, they gather these tiny pieces and assemble them, and from that try to analyze the events. It's truly impressive, and of course, a lot of it depends on the ability to recover pieces of significant size, and of course, there's always hope that in additional reviews of the data and things of that sort, they'll be able to learn more than they now know, and reviewing the data that NASA keeps, the records they keep on all the parts and pieces that go into a spacecraft of this type.
Professor McCurdy, assuming that we do get some at least general idea of what caused this accident, and that perhaps they can rectify that on future missions, what impact do you think today's tragedy will have, if any, serious long-term impact on America's space program?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be...
all he could to prevent the child's injury. The doctor's not being there is a common accusation in malpractice.
Is for the
Mercedes.
Is it going to be replaced?
Yes. We will find a way to replace that, because I think it's essential, and we're sort of self-insurers in that regard. But it is my judgment that the American public will want that program to go ahead, and will want to really carry out the program, try to attain the goals that those people on board, the 7 crew members.
Sometimes painful things like this happen. The process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
There'll be hearings on Capitol Hill next month as the Congress and the administration take a look at the space program in light of what happened today. They'll examine the timetable, the question of manned versus unmanned flight, among other things. But there seems to be no inclination in the Capitol tonight to give up. The space program will go on, as the president said, bloodied but unbowed. Peter?
Sam, we both know that the president has an incredible capacity to comfort the nation at times like this. I thought today he was as eloquent as I'd ever heard him. You tell me from your own perspective why you think this Capitol stopped so suddenly today.
Well, it stopped because it was shocked. It's never seen anything like this before. People have already said tonight on your broadcast, Peter, it had gone so well.
Is the Space Shuttle program...
rockets.
It's not often that a teacher is at a loss for words. I know my students will think so. I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. When that shuttle goes, there might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me. Thank you.
The commander of the
As you could see, or hear, we're having a bit of a problem with the sound. We'll try to get to that important report in just a moment.
It was to have been a special day for President Reagan, the day in which he delivered his 5th State of the Union address to Congress and to the nation. But the unfortunate events, the explosion of the shuttle,
Apollo-Soyuz, would
postpone his address. It becomes the first time in U.S. history that a president has delayed the speech. Instead, a saddened president delivered a very different message, a message of sympathy to the families of those killed, and a pledge that the space program will continue. John Aubuchon has more from the White House.
NASA wants to get off on schedule, but I think that
to prove it's okay, or they wouldn't have gone.
They've delayed when it made sense to.
The families, and I don't know that I've ever been more touched because Mrs. Scobie, the wife of the commander of the flight, said she was speaking for all of the families, and the message that she wanted to tell the Vice President and Senator Glenn and I was that the space program should go ahead. They didn't want it slowed down or stopped. And they knew that their husbands and wives, families would want that too.
NASA is busy with an investigative team already analyzing what happened. They went through their plan with us before we left for how they're planning to investigate the whole thing. And they'll find out what went wrong before anybody else is launched.
John Glenn, who went to Cape Canaveral tonight with Vice President George Bush and Jake Garn. As you heard, they met with the families. The indication from the senators, of course, was that the families of those people who are the regular astronauts, the 6 members of the space crew, indicated to the Vice President that they wanted this program to go on. We have our correspondents assorted around the country right now. Steve Delaney is at Cape Canaveral, Kennedy Space Center. And Dan Molina is
commit the an automobile accident, and so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
Senator John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth, called today's tragedy an unspoken dread that we've lived with.
We had hoped to push this day back forever, but that was not to be, and we all, I guess, intuitively knew that. So today we don't want to repeat, that's for sure.
Shortly before 6 tonight, the flag over the White House was lowered to half-staff. The president ordered all U.S. flags on federal property to be flown at half-staff through next Monday to honor the Challenger crew.
The president told us earlier that he would work to prevent any public backlash against the space program.
About 18 months.
Dika, you were there during the other horrible NASA accident, the Apollo fire. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how long it took.
I don't think it is necessary for politicians to go up. I think.
But what happens to your head when that happens to people you know and work with?
Less threat to human life. So that those kind of considerations may well come into play when Congress begins to think about whether to appropriate that extra $2 billion to buy another shuttle orbiter.
And Dan Molina, what are they saying in Houston in terms of the future of the program? All of the money continue to go into the shuttle program, or is there any talk around the edges down there, at least, of diversification of some kind?
Tom, we're really not hearing anything about that here tonight. I must say, walking around here at the Johnson Space Center this evening, what I see is an amazing focus of energy. It seems like the people here at the Johnson Space Center now are attacking the biggest problem perhaps that they have ever tackled, and that's finding out what went wrong with this thing. I see this focus of professionalism, which we've come to identify with the space program, mobilizing itself this evening here. There's none of the political talk here. What there is this mobilization of effort to try and find out what in the world went wrong.
And Steve Delaney at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral tonight. What about the personal side? Down there you were mingling, as it were, as I guess a kind of novice yourself, watching the first shuttle launch that you have seen so far. The people who came to watch today, not only Krista McAuliffe's parents, but her husband and children, as well as members of her son's 3rd grade class were there. Are any of those people left around there, and what has been the personal reaction to what was witnessed there today?
Well, I think we have to go back to what the senators were saying when Senator Garn was saying when he came back. We have not had any contact with the members of the families, but I'd like to chip in a thought that because there was a teacher in space and because so many children around the country were watching this liftoff, it was almost their flight, their surrogate, their teacher, or somebody representing their interest was along. And it was a way to draw young people into the mystique of space, to kind of make the linkage between the John Glenn era and the idea of getting out and dealing with the idea that the future is really up there where those 7 people disappeared to tonight. That one of the things that will impel more movement toward finding out what went wrong and towards coping with the disaster that happened here today is to redeem the American promise, the promise of space for those kids, to indicate somehow to them that it shouldn't end this way, or it shouldn't be a setback, that there is something grand and something glorious to be attained out there, and that the space program, almost for that reason, will have to go on and will have to redeem itself and to kind of erase what happened here today.
Robert Bazell in Pasadena, I want to talk with you about some of the personal side as well. You knew Dick Scobie, who was the commander of this flight. In fact, you had a conversation with him at one point about the possibility that something could go terribly wrong as it did today, didn't you?
That's true, Tom. We've been talking about that a lot today on many of the NBC programs. Dick Scobie was a fighter pilot. He was a test pilot. He was decorated. He had received many medals for action in Southeast Asia. And we were driving back from the Cape one afternoon, and he told me that he thought that someday this would happen. He said, he put it very bluntly. He said, someday the shuttle's going to blow up. And I think his wife expressed what were his views, what he told me, this was several years ago. He said that he really wanted the shuttle program to go on, but he said that it was inevitable. It's a complex piece of machinery. It's got enough explosives in it to make it into a small bomb if something goes wrong, and that's exactly what happened today. So I don't think to the astronauts in the program, I don't even think to the engineers in the program that this is a terrible surprise that this happened sometime. I mean, nobody knows why it happened today. But I think that everybody thought that it was inevitable that eventually it would happen. Obviously, it's a terrible setback, and nobody ever wanted it to be. But as some of the people we've talked to over the course of today have pointed out, it's a machine, and no perfect machine has ever been built. And when this machine went wrong, it caused a terrible tragedy.
The fact is that it's sometimes hard to convey the commitment and the dedication of the astronauts to that program. They have given up their life in many instances to NASA, and I don't mean that in the cruelest possible form, but that is it's a very rigorous program in which they're engaged. They have to move to Texas in most cases. They spend long hours at what to the rest of us would be boring, even tedious tasks. They have to face disappointment. Some of these people who have been in the program for a long time have not yet been in space. They've had to wait for many months, even years to go up. Judy Resnick was one of the astronauts who died today in the explosion aboard the shuttle Challenger. She was someone that I knew relatively well because we met when the first shuttle was scheduled to be launched, and she was assigned to NBC News as our expert commentator. And I used to talk to her about this at some length. Here was a classical pianist. She had a PhD in electrical engineering, and yet her life was absolutely given over to NASA and to the idea of being an astronaut. At the same time, she did have a pretty good sense of humor. We used to have a little friendly bet from time to time about whether NASA could keep its launch schedule. And when I lost one, for a six-pack, quite honestly, I sent it to her at some expense, wrapped in a dozen long-stem roses. And she immediately sent back the message that she loved the beer, but the roses she didn't need necessarily. So these are people who believe very strongly in the space program and want it to go on. In all the history of spaceflight, however, there never has been a disaster like the one that we witnessed today. 7 lives lost, 7 families in mourning tonight, along with the rest of the nation. And as NBC's Dennis Murphy reports now, the grief is shared by the entire NASA community.
Across the bay from the launch pad, Titusville, America's space town, was stunned and silent at the news.
Now the close-up on your left, there is the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, about 11:39 Eastern Time.
Offices stopped.
We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion.
I just started crying and backed up.
Looking for
one of the engines failed. The spacecraft aborted into a low orbit, but the mission's experiments were successfully carried out and played the problem.
That has struck me today in all the phrases about that.
It's hit this area real hard. People take it real personal. This is the pride of Titusville.
Titusville and the shuttle program are inseparable. 3 of the 5 city councilmen work for NASA. The astronauts killed in 1967 are remembered in city street names. The Chamber of Commerce has an old Titan missile in the yard. The elementary school is called Apollo, and the high school is known as Astronaut. There are 14,000 people here who...
Space Insurance Company. It was handled through Lloyd's of London, which says it will pay the claim. A spokesman said that McAuliffe's family will be paid in the next couple of days. The Challenger crew had signed routine waiver agreements before the launch, absolving the government of any liability in their deaths should that take place.
Here on CNN, we will continue to keep you up to the minute in this ongoing story, the aftermath of the disaster today aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger.
At the top of the hour, our live coverage continues, and we end this hour with a profile of Krista McAuliffe, one of the 7 crew members, the best known perhaps. It's a look at her and her family and the dreams they shared. CNN's Carol Buckland has the story.
Krista McAuliffe from Concord, New Hampshire. One of the things that I would like to do when I go aboard the shuttle is to bring back the wonder of it all.
The NBC News at the Kennedy Space Center.
No doubt, all of America could have learned something from Krista McAuliffe, the high school.
The old lessons of mortality. Of the real risk, which gives any victories their meaning.
Well, I was really amazed to see it because I never thought explosion would really ever happen.
I was pretty scared because I thought it could have been my science teacher that was going to be hurt in it.
A finalist in the teacher selection.
It's something that'll take a long time for people to get over, but I really feel that it's worth every effort to continue the space program.
Space shuttle explodes, get it right now.
In the streets and stores across America today, that same feeling in the gut we had known before.
Well, I think it's very tragic. I think it's the most tragic thing since the death of Kennedy himself.
I got the same sick kind of feeling that I used to get when I was in Vietnam. Just a horrible feeling.
The feeling that you get, that cold feeling all over that only happens maybe 5 times in your lifetime.
We were all set up for it, watching.
Many of us were watching.
This time, the space age was really going to begin. One of us was going, not just a teacher, but a mother, a private citizen, your neighbor.
That's very upset. After all that about Krista McAuliffe, it's almost as if you know her.
Today, in the United States military and scientific communities which built the space program, the professionals tried to handle their losses.
Today, it's a very somber, grave-like situation here.
The NASA public affairs officer with us was in tears because he had worked with these people. And it is...
On the picture, Krista wrote a little note to Gene, and this is what she said. She said, "May your future be limited only by your dreams." Charles Osgood, CBS News.
Okay.
Flying through space.
It's hurting all of us around Concord.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
We'll take it for granted.
There will be, of course, long investigations and examinations of what happened today at Cape Canaveral. The argument will be buttressed for those who have been opposed to manned spaceflight all along. They'll now add the question of safety to their arguments. And NASA, of course, their engineers will have to look very carefully at what happened today to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Those of us who have watched the development of our space program from the very beginning, long before man first essayed a trip into space, we saw a lot.
A very short skirt.
In such a festive fashion, filled with expectation and celebration. The shuttle, after all, is a kind of national symbol. And this time, a pretty, perky school teacher was on board. Her parents, her husband, her children, her students, all looking on and cheering, awaiting another triumph of technology. And then the explosion. Something that we have all talked about but never quite believed would happen. It was a humbling, sobering experience, a common bond, a reminder of the supreme sacrifices that others make so that we may go on to new frontiers of the human experience. NBC News will continue its coverage of the tragedy of the Challenger beginning tomorrow morning with NBC News at sunrise, followed by the Today program. For now, I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News. Good night from all of us.
Go to First National. Works the best.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink. The vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at the continuing operation.
We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Allison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista Mikaloff. We mourn their loss as a nation together.
And that's the independent news for this Tuesday, January 28th.
Put them high on the list of men and women who counted. These searchers and seekers, these astronauts and teachers who died today in what became...
Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
This has been an...
also offers a tremendous... Bring this story, this historic and terrible day for the space program.
In this hour, we'll take a look at the day from the beginning as the pre-dawn countdown got underway at the Kennedy Space Center.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
It was the first launch from the newly refurbished pad 39B.
The Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville are trying to find out why this happened. They are analyzing difficulty prior to the horror information that may give some answers.
Nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
A signal.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Oh my God. The explosion appeared to destroy Challenger. The solid rocket boosters emerged from the fireball, continuing to fly uncontrollably for several seconds before plunging into the Atlantic Ocean, leaving a trail of smoke. The Coast Guard immediately launched an emergency rescue effort, but all that was found were small pieces of debris scattered over a wide area. NASA officials put together...
Was dead, extinguished in a flash. There were 7 victims who died today, and millions of others who still live.
Velocity 2,900 feet per second.
Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Cocoa Beach, Florida.
High school students had gathered to watch the launch of their star social studies teacher. It took a minute to realize that what they were watching was a disaster.
Like to hear about it or not?
Students were dismissed about an hour later, still no. Afterward, the principal said guidance counselors will try to move on. Anguished by the tragedy. McAuliffe was one of them that conquered high.
Loading equipment. T-minus 1 minute.
That they shouldn't discontinue it. These things are going to happen all the time, and I hope not all the time, but they're going to happen once in a while, and we've got to take it in stride.
Well, I felt that it was a tragedy, as everyone else did. But I still feel the space program is a good one.
I don't know, I was pretty shocked since we hadn't had but once, you know, that when those guys on the ground had problems. I don't know, it was just pretty shocking.
Well, I saw it, you know, live coverage, and it was just pretty unbelievable. You know, I knew right away something was wrong. But I don't know, it's just a real shock after all the times it's gone straight.
One man who says he's just as shocked as anyone is aerospace...
T-minus 1 minute and counting. Sound suppression water system now armed. The hydrogen burn igniters have been armed. These igniters will be fired at T-minus 10 seconds to burn off any residual hydrogen gas. T-minus 45 seconds and counting. The solid rocket booster flight instrumentation recorders have gone into the record mode. Coming up on the 30-second point in our countdown. T-minus 30 seconds, and we've had a go for auto sequence start. The SRB hydraulic power units have started.
T-minus 21 seconds, and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel cells. 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up. 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point. Contingency procedures are in effect. We will report more as we have information available. Again, to repeat, we have a report relayed through the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field. We have no additional word at this time.
visible in between. As we roll this ahead in slow motion, another flame leak appears above about 1 second later. Then, scant tenths of a second later, a large clear flame, and then the last massive explosion. The Challenger enveloped in a terrible fireball over the next 3 seconds. Finally, just past 1 minute and 14 seconds, you can see one of the solid rocket boosters blown aside in the top right-hand corner of the screen, the booster shooting off away from the fireball. The 7 crew members aboard Space Shuttle Challenger today were Spacecraft Commander Francis R. Dick Scobie, 46, born in Washington State, who flew combat in Vietnam. The pilot today was 40-year-old Mike Smith, born Beaufort, South Carolina, a naval aviator and test pilot who'd flown 28 different kinds of aircraft. Judith Resnick, 36, hometown Akron, Ohio, an electrical engineer who earlier became this nation's second woman in space. 35-year-old Ronald McNair. He held a doctorate from MIT, was a scholar from Lake City, South Carolina. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ellison Onasuka, who was from Hawaii. He was 39 and last year took part in America's first manned military space flight. 41-year-old Gregory Jarvis, a native of Detroit, was bumped from Columbia's December flight to today's Challenger flight to make room for Congressman Bill Nelson as a congressional observer. And the 7th member of this crew was Krista Corrigan McAuliffe, the 37-year-old schoolteacher and mother of 2 from Concord, New Hampshire. What started as a party at Concord High School today ended in tears as students watching the launch learned about as hard a lesson as life offers. Steve Young was in Concord.
4, 3, 2, 1. About 300 Concord High School students had gathered to watch the launch of their star social studies teacher. It took a minute to realize that what they were watching was a disaster.
Like to hear about it or not?
Students were dismissed about an hour later, still numb.
Everybody's just like, they're all just falling apart, all the teachers and everything.
I don't ever want to go there. It's been proven unsafe.
Afterward, the principal said guidance counselors will try to help students anguished by the tragedy.
They're telling kids in particular that it's okay to feel bad about this. It's okay to be sorrowful. It's okay to cry.
McAuliffe was one of the most popular teachers at Concord High. Students followed her training every step of the way. The 37-year-old mother of 2 hoped to show by her example that space is a world open to anyone.
One of the things that I hope to bring back into the classroom is to make that connection with the students that they too are part of history, that the space program belongs to them.
We were with them on Saturday night, and her little girl said to me, "Mommy in space yet?" And I said, "No, not yet, pretty soon." And everybody was just so happy. Everybody was so thrilled that out of 11,000 teachers, Krista was the one that was selected.
There were mostly empty streets in Concord today and deserted shops as the town began to mourn.
I just watched it over again. It happened again. Very sad for the family and everybody.
One friend took a picture of Krista during a town celebration last summer. She picked it up just today, left with a photo and her greeting. Steve Young, CBS News, Concord.
Besides the symbolism of putting school teacher Krista Corrigan McAuliffe aboard today's flight to be the first public citizen American civilian in space, to spread the wonder and to inspire and teach the young back on Earth on live television, this Challenger mission had other goals in keeping with its reusable space plane, space truck workhorse role. It was supposed to put up a $100 million satellite that would have become part of NASA's own shuttle communications network. It was also supposed to launch a $10 million payload to study Halley's Comet. Coming up next, Leslie Stahl has the latest on President Reagan's reversal and eventual postponement of the State of the Union address, and Bob Simon will look at our space voyaging nation in a state of shock.
Ever try borrowing for something unusual, like a family gym? Big financial institutions don't always understand, but someone does. Hi, I'm Jack. The boss at Beneficial. We're big, but we have beneficial home equity loans just right for home improvement. It's just you and the boss, and a commitment, usually in 48 hours.
That does it.
Glad it worked out. Beneficial. Talk to the manager and you're talking to the boss.
Io ho un segreto di bellezza di grande valore che rende la mia pelle meravigliosamente vellutata e più giovanile.
It's the one secret 50 million women share, oil of Olay. So sheer it quickly penetrates, replenishing youthful fluids for a softer, younger look. Every day, women around the world believe in oil of Olay.
Riuscirà anche a mantenerti più giovane.
Also available in a new luxurious cream.
President Reagan at first today said he was going to go on through with tonight's scheduled State of the Union speech, then put it off when the full dimension of the tragedy in space sank in. White House correspondent Leslie Stahl reports.
At the White House, the president watched a replay of the tragedy this morning in stunned silence. He said it was a horrible thing, a tremendous shock.
Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country.
The president postponed his upbeat State of the Union speech tonight for 1 week and sent Vice President Bush off to Cape Canaveral this afternoon to convey his feelings personally to the families. But despite his sorrow, the president said he's determined that the space program continue.
We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here.
It was Mr. Reagan's idea to send a teacher into space. Kristen McAuliffe was his first thought when he heard the news this morning. The president called the entire crew courageous pioneers who gave their lives on the new frontier.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Leslie Stahl, CBS News, the White House.
Space Agency officials waited most of the day before saying anything, and when they did speak, it was only to say they won't say anything until and unless they know for sure what happened, what went wrong. David Martin reports the investigation, Day 1.
NASA doesn't know what happened, and neither do the makers of these white solid rocket boosters, which helped lift the shuttle from the launch pad.
I don't believe there's sufficient evidence on the replays to be able to ascertain the nature of the problem.
Or the makers of the orange external fuel tank, which carried 500,000 pounds of highly volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen.
What we have is what you see on television, and it's very hard to tell anything from that.
While investigators search for answers, there is only speculation by informed observers about the apparent leak which touched off the giant fireball, dwarfing the remains of one of the 140-foot solid rocket boosters.
It appears that there were some burn-throughs and some flame leaks coming out, and once this extremely hot gas comes out, it could ignite an explosion of the external tank.
But another expert said that alone could not have caused the massive fireball.
The very large explosion that took place would have to have involved the propellants in this large tank.
The hydrogen and oxygen.
Hydrogen and oxygen in that tank.
What could have caused the external tank to fail like that? Could it have been unexpected weather conditions high in the atmosphere?
Winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge, and we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Could it have been the ice which coated the shuttle just hours before launch? Most observers say no, since the launch was delayed to allow the ice time to melt.
Right now, there are many more questions than answers. Until the investigators can come up with both answers and solutions, no more Americans will venture into space. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
In a moment, the U.S. space program under pressure. Was it too much pressure?
Kellogg's Special K breakfast. Low fat, less than 220 calories. Try it on. You'll like what you see.
little 4-hour cough medicine didn't last me through the day.
I know.
The 6-hour didn't last me through the night.
I know, Alan.
Why doesn't somebody invent
A 12-hour cough medicine? Somebody has, Alan.
Introducing 12-Hour Delsum. Only Delsum has a patented time-release formula that lasts up to 12 hours, for hours more relief than regular cough medicine. Each dose helps you work all day and sleep all night. 12-hour time-release Delsum for hours more cough relief.
Terrific.
Even before today's tragedy, there were some who were raising questions about whether tighter dollars and tighter schedules for shuttle launches were forcing U.S. space scientists to promise more than they could deliver. Bob Schieffer has been looking into this. Bob?
Welcome back to Earth, you seasoned space veterans.
It has become so routine, we tend to forget how complicated and dangerous it has always been. Ironically, yesterday was the 19th anniversary of the only other fatal accident in the U.S. space program, the 1967 explosion that took the lives of astronauts Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, who were killed when their rocket blew up on the launch pad.
We've gone for main engine.
As NASA moved into the shuttle era, the agency argued the flights were becoming safe enough for civilians to go along. Today, former astronaut Frank Borman said that was wrong.
It's a little improper to believe that we can put congressmen and senators and school teachers up there without exposing them to dangers that before were simply accepted by test pilots.
There have been close calls all along. In 1970, an oxygen tank blew up on a spacecraft headed for the moon. The astronauts got home safely. But James Lovell, who was on board, said the danger of spaceflight can never be discounted.
We're going at high speeds, great pressures going through the atmosphere. So this business is not your regular 8 to 5 business.
As the astronauts switched from space capsules to the shuttle, there were frequent equipment problems. In 1983, for example, no one was hurt, but power units caught fire as one flight was returning to Earth.
If we haven't been pushing our luck, we really have been pushing the technology pretty hard.
And with the federal deficit making it harder to fund the space program, Evel questions whether too many flights have been scheduled in an effort to make them more cost-effective.
I think the pressures, yes, I think the pressures have been there to increase the tempo and to, just as an airline does, make it pay for itself.
Whatever the case, the feeling from Capitol Hill tonight is that funding will now be harder to come by. NASA had hoped that putting civilians like Krista McAuliffe on board would build more public support for the space program. But after today's tragedy, the result may be just the opposite. Dan?
Thank you, Bob. The Challenger was one of 4 shuttles, a kind of flying mule, a dependable mule that had flown successfully many times before. We're going to show you one of those flights from last October 30th, side by side with today's disastrous mission. Challenger's 3 main engines had just throttled up normally. Then the explosion. It happened about the time when wind and other atmospheric conditions would begin to place maximum pressure on the craft. Had the flight gone on as planned, the 2 solid rocket boosters would have flamed out and peeled away. That was scheduled to happen within a minute past where the blast happened today. We'll have brief words on today's other news and more of our coverage of today's space shuttle disaster when we return.
Almost $1 billion every week. That's how much America spends on foreign oil. Just about $1 billion every week. To help control the cost of energy imports, we use energy efficiently. And we use our country's own energy resources, like electricity from coal and nuclear energy. Coal and nuclear energy are made in America. Coal and nuclear energy are homegrown.
I know I should get more fiber. Can you recommend something? Let me tell you about something really new. Correctol Natural Grain Laxative. Only new Correctol contains fruit fiber, along with the natural grain fiber doctors recommend most to help keep us regular day after day. No other fiber laxative has fruit fiber. Not Metamucil, not Fiberol. New Correctol Natural Grain with fruit fiber. That's for me. Correctol makes it for us.
Let us pause now for a few moments from our coverage of the Challenger tragedy to report some other news of the day. A spokesman today said that Lily Palmer, the author and actress, died yesterday in her Los Angeles home. Ms. Palmer made more than 50 movies. She was 71. The State Department now is warning Americans not to travel to the second largest city in Haiti, Cap Haitien. Yesterday, Haitian security forces shot 3 people to death in violent anti-government protests there. Several hundred foreign tourists have already fled the city. From around the world today, from the Soviet Union, from the nations of the West, from China, there were expressions on concern for America's loss. And as Bob Simon reports, in this country, grief spoke in one voice.
The Air and Space Museum in Washington is something of a cathedral to space exploration.
Something went terribly wrong with the shuttle Challenger this morning.
And people dropped by today as if they were going to church. It was the right place to be.
Frightening.
It's awful.
It had been an age of heroes, of pioneers. That's how it started. But then it became so routine, blast-offs weren't even carried live on television anymore. The shuttles were called bus trips into space, and anybody could ride them, even a high school teacher. It just didn't seem heroic anymore.
Sometimes there were delays. It had even gotten boring. Then in a flash, the shuttle chariot was swallowed in its own sun.
For America, it became a death in the family. For a senator who had flown in the shuttle.
I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident.
For some, there was only one point of comparison.
I think the last time I felt like that was when Kennedy was shot.
And like that day, an explosion was followed by silence. The nation stopped from Main Street to Wall Street.
We saw it come over the Dow Jones News, and the entire trading floor was just at a loss of words. Everything stopped trading.
I thought it was terrible. I was shocked. I was in tears. I couldn't believe it.
And then there was somehow that added poignancy because there was a teacher. It reminded us all.
It was the first one that was going to be able to really convey to us what it was going to be like in the space shuttle, and she never had a chance.
The bells of the National Cathedral tolled this afternoon for the dead. They were not all astronauts or pilots. They were women. They were Vietnam veterans. There were a black and an Oriental. There was even a man named Smith. They were Americans. Bob Simon, CBS News, Washington.
Through now. Commander Dick Scobie, followed by Mission Specialist Dee Russell, Ron McNair.
Graduation rehearsal. You wouldn't believe it.
I'm really going to miss you.
Did you decide which job to take?
Yeah, I'm going with that subsidiary of Dow. I could actually be helping high-risk heart patients.
You're pretty special.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Citibank. Ordinary Visa and MasterCards won't do. No, Citibank always has to be better. Just by using them, my son earns bonuses called Citi Dollars. They save him up to 40% on nice gifts. But does it get me a grandfather clock or a color television? No, not my son. Come on, Mom, let's go. Come on, just a few more miles on you. Keep pedaling down that road.
Citibank's Visa and MasterCard. It's Citibank that makes them better.